No wonder mama sent me to college. No wonder she said, son, remember, the power's in the knowledge. Power's in the knowledge. Join the glorious struggle to maintain and stand silent. One people on a mission of truth. You can't believe what they said about you. The power's in the knowledge.
Most anthropologists have been satisfied to go looking for vanishing little tribes, utterly irrelevant, the Booga Booga and the Luga Booga. And they go and they spend 6 months a year and they study all they know about the Luga Boogas. All their little ritual and their dances and their kinship system, who is my mother's brother, sister, son, etc. Utterly irrelevant to any illuminating vision of African civilization. And they come and they extrapolate masses of things about it. And so we have thousands and thousands of books about Africa that tell us absolutely nothing about the quintessential African. You cannot imagine what a Holocaust hit Africa. You cannot imagine what it is to take about 100 million people, the youngest people, and rip them out of the heart and core of a continent, the disintegration of family networks, the tremendous things that fell on Africa, the disease in one area in Tanzania. There were 5 million head of cattle. Europeans came in, introduced rinderpest, not deliberately, but they introduced it nevertheless. Almost all the cattle disappeared. You cannot imagine in the Americas, millions of people vanished just because of the common cold which Europeans had introduced in America. You're not aware of the massive destruction of civilization, so that people could mock us now and say, are you talking about all the great things that you did? If you did all of these great things, why are you not great now? What has happened to you? Why are you so broken and shattered and fragmented and lost? Why do you feel so inferior? We feel inferior and fragmented because we have lost a sense of the wholeness of our history. Because we can only heal, and this is true for the black as well as for the white, both the prisoner and the imprisoned, both the prisoner, and the jailer. We are doing this because it is necessary to revise the history of man. The tremendous anguish which is deep in the heart of all of us, which arises out of these falsehoods, the falsehoods upon which this civilization are built, have got to go.
Africans with jet black faces once walked the earth all alone, no other races, until he traveled to the other lands colder than the motherland, and then the cross began. That's when the frost began, the pigment loss began. The further north this man traveled as he crossed new land, the man in the ice who once walked in the sand, soon he began to lose his
This is a
tan.
figure, a sculpture that was found
Get on the inside.
Europe, and one of the things that they have
He was still
discovered is
African.
that many of the sculptures of early Europe show various African types. In fact, 55,000 years ago, according to 3 labs, the University of Oxford, the University of Hawaii, the University of California at Berkeley have come to the conclusion that there are no people on the earth 55,000 years ago who are not black Africans.
Same thing would have been true.
Okay.
Then this is bone evidence. There is a rule by one of the old Egyptologists and paleontologists that said that the typical Kemetic type was short arm and negrito, if you look at all the skeletal remains. Then the fifth...
we'll go to the next. I think we
can go to the next. This would be a slide of the from the tomb of Ramesses III, showing the 2 black figures in there. One is Kemetic and the other is Nubian, showing that there's no difference between the Kamite and the Nubian, but the other 2 are Asian and kind of European, and there is a pictured difference in that tomb between the Asians and Europeans, but not between the Egyptians and the Nubians. I think that's very important. The Kemetic people call themselves black people. And Cheikh Anta Diop, again, has gone through the proof of that through the analysis of certain Medu Neter hieroglyphic designations. In particular, the name Kemet, K-M-T, not just K-M. K-M is black, but when you add the T to it as a determinative, and when you add the key to it, Kemetu, and when you add the determinative, little man and little woman with 3 strokes under them, that's the plural. So that's man and woman plural. That means people. And Kemetu means the black people, not the black land. And that argument has been made in Cairo, by the way, at the symposium sponsored by UNESCO, where everybody was invited to talk about the color of the ancient Egyptian, or the race of the ancient Egyptian. Logic, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music, what we call the 7 liberal arts. This was the educational system that was in place at the time that Greek people came to Kemet.
Now go back and show who the people were that established this.
Okay, the people, the ones
images you showed earlier.
Okay, the images that we're showing are these people. See, now I just skipped back to the 12th dynasty, but in this dynasty, these people were teaching trigonometry. In other words, we have papyri with math problems on them, the Rhind papyrus, the Moscow papyrus, with problems on them. These papyri were written in the 12th dynasty, and they had problems not only in geometry, but also in trigonometry. That just gives you an example of how much, how highly developed mathematics to the world.
All right.
Put my glasses on and actually read this a little bit. Yes. Problem number 56 in the Rhind mathematical papyrus, that's the one you see up there, seeks to find the slope of a pyramid whose height is 250 cubits and whose base is 360 cubits. The answer is 5 1/25 palms for each cubit in height, representing the cotangent of the angle of the slope of the pyramid's face. Now, if you've got a cotangent, if you can find cotangents, you know the way you can find tangents is that you flip the cotangent over. It's the inverse of a tangent. The other thing, too, just look at that. Imagine that that pyramid is three-dimensional, because that's what it's supposed to be. Now, all you really have to do is inscribe a triangle inside that pyramid, a right triangle whose height is also the same as the height of the pyramid. Therefore, the face becomes the hypotenuse, and half of the pyramid's base becomes the base of that right triangle, and then the height of the pyramid becomes the height of the right triangle. When you have all that in place, and it's really just a matter of drawing it in, you then can find sine and cosine. So now, if they have the tangent and cotangent and the ability to find sine and cosine, by definition, they have trigonometry. They have trigonometry.
Seven wonders of the world. This magnificent structure stands as tall as a 45-story building and is comprised of nearly 2.5 million stone blocks, which weigh an average of 2.5 tons each. This one building is comprised of enough stone to make 30 Empire State Buildings. The temple complex of P.T.A.H, now called Karnak, was one of the greatest accomplishments ever achieved in Kemet. It is comprised of numerous temples, one of which contains the largest colonnaded hall ever constructed. This great hall consists of 136 columns, which stand in 16 rows. The tallest columns are 69 feet high and are large enough to accommodate a group of 100 men standing on its apex. This one room has enough floor space to equal the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. And the entire complex is large enough to accommodate all of the churches built in London since the birth of Jesus the Christ.
Look at this.
Go ahead.
Look at this. Who built like this? Awesome or what? Now look.
Both sides. Everything is an echo and echo and echo. They haven't even begun to question the basics in this civilization. As Dr. Diop has shown, that a great deal of the Greek science, and we're not attacking the Greeks, because they had their own genius too, but the basis, all these things they claimed, you see, Hippocrates, taking sections out of the work of earlier Egyptian writers without giving any credit to them at all. Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem was worked out long ago. Pythagoras spent 7 years, some people say 22 in Egypt. And he comes back with all this, even medical theories, and brings it all back to Greece and all the claim. All the great European scholars went to Africa. Thales of Miletus, Democritus, Pythagoras, Eudoxus. There's a whole list of them walking into Africa, picking up things from astronomy, geometry, medicine, etc., and going back home and claiming it to be theirs. Father of this and father of that, when they're the children. To come on the ladder. No, sir. It's just the opposite. When you go and look at their medicine, I spoke in Atlanta to the Center for Disease Control. Africans had aspirin before us. They were using Salix capensis, which is salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. They were using tetracycline 14 centuries ago in Nubia. They found the yellow-green flash of tetracycline in Nubian bones 14 centuries ago. They only started using that antibiotic in America in the 1950s. They pioneered in several operations. They pioneered in the cesarean operation. Dr. Finch has written a fine thing on the cesarean. At the time when that operation was experimental in Europe, people like Dr. Felkin went into Africa and observed the Banyoro surgeons performing the cesarean, and the mother was hale and hearty after 4 or 5 days. No woman survived the cesarean in Europe in the 1870s. None. No woman survived. And they observed the operation, the way they stitched, the way they opened the belly, the kind of instruments they used. They observed they were using one of the instruments, the cautery iron, with such fantastic skill. It was very minor tissue damage. It caused great ruptures in the European hospitals. They found that Africans were using both anesthetics and antiseptics in their operating theaters at that time, when in Europe, Lister only introduced antiseptics 2 years earlier than the witness of this operation, which the witness said must have been going on for quite a while, because the Africans were performing with routine skill what was then experimental surgery in Europe.
No wonder Mama sent me to college. No wonder she said, son, remember the powers in the knowledge.
Point to the fact that the calendar we use today is derived from the Egyptian. They were the first people to invent the second of time, the second of art, the hour, the minute. Their astronomical observations over many years produced these ideas, these precise quantities and volumes and times and standards, which were later to dominate the world. The Babylonians did not have any proper calendar. The Egyptians had the 365 and a quarter days. That calendar was invented in Ethiopia since 4241 BC. And before I leave Egypt, as I say, I don't want to dwell too much on that, but other parts of Africa. But before I leave that, let me mention the discovery, the significant discovery, which Sheikh Anthony pointed to today, of P.T.A.H, the discovery of a monarchy in the Nile Valley preceding the Egyptian, at least 2 centuries before the first Egyptian dynasty. And at P.T.A.H, they found not only architectural forms to which Dr. Diop pointed to this morning, they found the falcon god Horus, they found the crown, the unmistakable, the uniquely shaped crown of the Egyptians. They found the palace facades that were later used by the Egyptians, and above all, they found the hieroglyphs, so that the world's first major writing system is not even Egyptian, it is Ethiopian.
Back in the day when I was schooling, blind and unwise to the lies my professor was spewing forth like it was written in stone, I didn't know that under him, yo, the truth was unknown.
About 7 centuries ago, they found Africans were plotting an invisible star, Sirius B. Sirius A is a bright star we all see in the night sky. Sirius B is impossible to see with the naked eye. It is impossible to see it with the naked eye. It has a magnitude of about 8.5. And the Africans not only saw it, they plotted its orbit and trajectory right up to the end of the 20th century, up to the year 1990. And the diagram produced by our best astronomy today is identical with what they produced centuries ago. We only became aware of that star towards the end of the 19th century. And not only that, they intuited its mass. This is a white dwarf. It is an imploded star. It's not only impossible to see with the naked eye, it is the most sophisticated astronomy that has shown us that a star so imploded is much heavier than stars that appear 6 times brighter and larger. They came to that conclusion. They had plotted the spiral structure of the Milky Way. They had seen the Jupiter and Saturn, the rings and the moons thereof. They had worked all of that out, but particularly Sirius B. It caused such astonishment, such consternation in astronomical circles that Kenneth Brecher of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he said, the Africans have no business knowing any of this. All destroyed. And yet the fragments exist, so significant that we have 10 major medical texts in African languages. The first medical texts in the world are in African language. The first mathematical papyri which you saw this morning, that's African. Those are the first. Even today, with all the destruction, we could still go back to the African documents and show them on a street. The Ebers papyrus, the Edwin Smith papyrus, the Smith papyrus, which is 1500 BC. They have chapters on helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy diagnosis, circulation of the blood, the pulse, diagnostic percussion, all that, chapters, intestinal disease and all that 1500 years before Christ. Africans.
The architect responsible for the design of the step pyramid was a man named Imhotep. Imhotep was recorded in history as the world's first multi-genius. He is a prime minister to Zoser. He was a poet, a philosopher, a physician. He is considered to be the author of the world's oldest medical treatise ever written. It is a document that is now called the Edwin Smith Medical Papyrus. This book describes 48 different injuries to the head, to the face, to the neck, and the spinal column. It is held in high regard by members of the International College of Surgeons in Chicago, and it is noted for its accuracy and high scientific standard.
My teacher, he had nothing much to say to me. Kept seeking the truth, only more questions came to me. Kept seeking the truth about how all this came to be. Kept seeking the truth about how they was blaming me. Kept seeking the truth, and now it's plain to see. Kemet knew, made it all clear to me. The man with the ice, guess what?
There are so many evidences apart from the question of what the Greeks said, who actually saw these Egyptians, apart from all the evidence that Sheikh Antioch has brought forward and others, there is evidence, the migration, the movement of agriculture. Every major plant in Egypt, at least half a dozen are found coming from the south. There's not a single plant that comes down to the south. This nonsense about civilization, that civilization in Egypt was created by Asiatics and Caucasoids, and then they brought the light of civilization down to the benighted black barbarians in the south. Not a single shred of evidence. The script comes up, the agriculture comes up, all the symbols comes up, the conceptions of God, and all the various forms that were to become deities in Egypt. It all comes from the south. The art, everything, you can see its origin in the south, in that Ethiopian and Sudanic world. And Ta-Seti is the culmination, it's the capping of the evidence. They found, for example, mathematical systems in Africa. The first use of numbers, the first scientific evidence of the use of numbers is found in the Congo Zaire. It's known as the Ishango bone. It's 8,000 years old. It's very simple, but it is cited because it's the first evidence we do have. But we have found more complex, far more complex mathematical systems, like the Yoruba, for example, are found to be using a complex mathematical system which one of the mathematicians, Conan, calls one of the most abstract and complex mathematical systems. Why didn't we know about this? Because if you go among the Bushmen and the Kalahari, or the Wugabuga and the Lugabuga, you're not going to find mathematics. Antique. Look at mathematics in Europe. It was nothing. Do you know that when the number system 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that's Hindu, the Arabs and Africans invaded Europe as Moors, and the Arabs brought from India the numbers Fibonacci, yes, brought it to Europe first in 1202, but the Europeans didn't accept it because the church said numbers are works of the devil. It's as late as the 17th century.
He said that, he became more alert and more human being. He became more, you see, Malone became a more human being. Not just human being, you became a more yourself. You achieve your destiny when you go to Kemet school. You became a human being, more human. We are a human being already, but more human being. That means more wise. And when you go to Kemet school, when Plato himself compare what they do in Kemet school, I give Greek because it will be no debate. You see, it's our school in Greece, the way we are doing things is just for creatures like pigs. You see, like pigs. You see, and he say myself, I'm ashamed. Myself as a plate, I'm ashamed. We do things like that, is a shame. And also, not only for myself, for all Greek, the Greek world is a shame. What we can do, our education, when you compare with a Kemet, is not even for human beings, it's just for pigs, for animals.
Presence in America, an academician, Sanarov, from one of the Soviet science cities, wrote me to talk about the various work that the Russians had been doing in this connection. They were dealing with Pacific connections while I was dealing with the Atlantic connections, and a dialogue began, and they informed me that one of their scientists, Volosimo, had discovered perfectly ground spherical crystal lenses in ancient Egypt, indicating that the Africans had telescopes. Galileo suggested the ancients had telescopes. He wasn't believed. Galileo used the African water clock in his experiments. Many of us like to make noise today about colored people's time. There's no such thing. That is slave time. These are the things where we start to glorify incompetence, to glorify inefficiency. The Africans were remarkable in those times because they were the best in their field. They strove for excellence. Not everyone can be excellent, but you have to strive for it. It has to be an ideal. You don't just take for granted because you've been beaten down in a society, in a culture, in a period of time, that you must aspire to the worst in that society because that is what is expected of you. What they expect of us is their bloody business. It is what we expect of ourselves.
So make no mistake, you are dealing with extraordinary people. Because the next myth coming up in the 21st century is how the Japanese are the superior people of the world. It's going to shift from the European to the Asiatic. So get it quite clear. In the very early stages of civilization, something very unusual happened. I was with my wife in Egypt last summer and we went to Aswan. And I looked at a block, an obelisk, a stone obelisk which had been cut many centuries ago. And I looked at the way it had been cut, the perfection of the cut. I looked at the stone. And I wondered why they had abandoned this obelisk. They abandoned it, they said, because it had a flaw. And I looked carefully. It is true, my eyes are not what they used to be. I could not see this flaw, so I used my hands, which are extremely sensitive. And it had to be pointed out to me where the flaw was, and it was very clear to me it would have taken centuries for that flaw to really make a difference. But our people didn't play around with things. It had to be perfect. When the Japanese were building the pyramid, when they tried to put the stones in alignment, they cracked and broke and were badly scratched. When they went to check the stones that the Egyptians had put into alignment, 1/1000th of an inch accurate, not a single stone was scratched or cracked. You are dealing with people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standard.
Want to see the proof? Want to get that power? The power's in the knowledge, but it only comes to you when you know what your ancestors did, because only then do you know what you can do. The power's in the knowledge.
The civilization of Egypt and of Africa in general is the most written about and the least understood of all known subjects. This is not an accident or an error in misunderstanding the available information. Except for Egypt, African people have been written out of the respectable commentary of history. Europeans have claimed the non-African creation of Egypt in order to downgrade the position of African people in world history. They have laid the foundation of what they call Western civilization on a structure that the Western mind did not create. In doing so, they have used no logic. Egypt, a Nile Valley civilization, was already old before Europe was born. Nile Valley civilization also existed before the Western Asian civilization of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. This fact was acknowledged for years by the European academic hypocrites who thought they had gotten away with claiming Egypt as a European or at least Asian creation. The archaeological research of Europeans disproved their claim. They cannot find a single artifact in Western Asia or in mainland Asia that was older than the artifacts of Nile Valley civilization or Africa in general. This revelation created a new dilemma for the European claimers of Egypt. They were saying, in effect, figuratively speaking, a child gave birth to himself, then he created his own mother.
Back in the day when I was schooling, blind and unwise to the lies my professor was spewing forth like it was written in stone. I didn't know that under him, yo, the truth was unknown. The power's in the knowledge.
One thing that is indubitably clear is that Africa is the cradle of the entire human race. From 4 million years ago, all the way up to 200,000 years ago, the stepwise sequence leading in an evolutionary progression from early pre-human hominid ancestors all the way up to modern human beings occurred in Africa and Africa alone. Not that there weren't any migrations out of Africa, but those migrations did not have any impact on human evolutions leading up to modern human beings until after our human beings in fact left Africa. Now what do I mean by that? A man by the name of Wainscott from England has said is that all of the populations around the globe are descendants from small founder populations that left Africa probably no later than 100,000 years ago. This means that, as C.W. Stringer has said, that all 6.5 billion people on this planet are Africans under the skin. Because if we go back far enough, everyone has
Africans with jet black faces once walked the earth all alone, no other races, until he traveled to the other lands colder than the motherland, and then the cross began.
Superiority or inferiority. And so for approximately how many years
man traveled as he
was
crossed
the
new
world
land, the man in the
populated
ice who once walked in the
exclusively
sand.
and only
Soon he
by
began
Africans,
to lose
black
his
Africans?
taste.
Okay, black skin.
If you're talking about the modern, the last African, okay, because you see, the African is not only the first hominid, he's also the first human. Okay, the hominid is not completely human like us, but then comes the first human without brain case, that's also African. And this begins to change about 55,000 years ago in Europe, where you get Africoid types becoming Caucasoid types.
Once again, this woman would have been how old now?
250,000 years old. Now,
least.
just by way of comparison, the oldest Homo sapiens sapiens bones that we find in Europe are 50,000, about 40,000 to 50,000 years old. This is the Grimaldi skeletons that were found in the Grimaldi cave.
So you have the African, how long ago now?
You have the African at least 200,000 years before they moved to the European continent.
And the European comes on the scene when?
Well, the African comes on the scene in Europe approximately 50,000 years ago. In other words, the first European was an African too, and is still an African. It's just an African who has changed.
And once again, what happened to that African once he got to Europe?
Well, you had several ice ages that and a change in environment, and the theory is that the change in environment, and especially the ice age part of it, being cut off from the African continent, having a completely different environment with respect to diet and climate and all those things, resulted over a 20,000 year period in physical changes, genetic mutations to adapt to that particular environment, and about 20,000 years or so ago, we have changes sufficient that we look and see distinct people when they really aren't distinct in that sense, in the sense of having groups that can't interbreed. That's what one of the biological definitions of race is, that groups can't, a dog and a cow can't have offspring, so they would be different strains, but varieties of the same family, so that the European that resulted was merely a depigmented African.
That's when the frost began, the pigment loss began. The further north this man traveled as he crossed new land. The man in the ice who once walked in the sand. Soon he began to lose his tan. Yet on the inside, he was still African.
But what's important is that when Kemet appears in the human record, it appears in 3100 BC with a fully developed civilization. Writing was already in place, astronomy was already in place. They already had the 365-day-year calendar and 1 quarter for the leap year and all of that. That calendar had actually been put in place around 4236 BC. So we're talking about a fully developed, high technical civilization.
It's true.
The power's in the knowledge.
Determine the circumference of the Earth unless you had, of course, presupposed that the Earth was round. We want to point that out. All of the mathematics that we study today has its roots in Africa. We can start off simply with counting. The very first or the oldest known artifact in mathematics is the Ashango bone. That's over 8,000 years old. It's from the Congo. That's found in Africa. If we go ahead, they had developed fractions. Furthermore, they had developed algebra and, of course, geometry, trigonometry, and it even gone as far as the roots of integral calculus. And this is all before Europe existed.
The pyramid rises to a height of 481.5 feet. It is built of 2.7 million blocks of stone. The smallest stone is 2.5 tons, and the largest stone is somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. If you were to take the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid, by the way, can you hear me in the back? I don't want you to miss any of this. If you could take all of the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid and cut it up into 1-foot blocks, you could build a wall that would circle 2/3 of the globe. And you know they built it without even using the wheel? They used to float 1,000-ton blocks of granite from Aswan 500 miles down the river, and they can't even do that today. The pyramid was oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The base of the pyramid, the side of each base of the pyramid was 755 feet, 6 inches, with an average error of 1/10,000th. The casing stones that covered the pyramid were so finely jointed that you could not and cannot insert a piece of your hair in between the joints, even today, where they are still in existence. The area of the base of the pyramid is 13 acres. But it's real interesting. If you look at the height of the pyramid, it is, if you measure it, it is the radius of a circle that you can create by turning the base of the square base of the pyramid into a circle. And therefore, you can find the square base by the area of the perimeter of the square base by 2 pi r. So that means they had built the constant, the geometric constant of pi, into the pyramid. The descending passage was precisely aligned to the North Pole star that was in place 3,350 years BC, which and it used to shine down to the grotto into a pool of water, and of course it's only in that place once every 26,000 years. The so-called ventilating shaft of the King's Chamber oriented exactly to Orion in the southern heavens, and the one from the Queen's Chamber is oriented exactly to Sirius, also in the southern heaven. There has never been anything like it in the world. Nothing. Do you know the other thing about the Great Pyramid? Where the Great Pyramid sits, if you were to take all the longitude, there are 360 degrees of longitude around the Earth, right? The longitude of the Great Pyramid goes through more landmass than any other longitude in the world. The latitude of the Great Pyramid, going right through the Great Pyramid, goes through more latitudinal landmass than any other latitude in the world. So the Great Pyramid, from the point of view of land, is the center of the Earth. This is the reason why that not only in Egypt, but in Greece, Rome, Palestine, India, and China, build their cities in fixed intervals to the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid was the prime meridian. The prime meridian we got now going through Greenwich, England, is a complete artifact. It's not based on anything. The original prime meridian was the Great Pyramid. Next slide, please.
Great pyramid, y'all.
Ayo. Ayo, ayo, ayo. Ayo jalan.
Great pyramid. Can't believe I'm here. This is all the folks. Beautiful thing. One people on a mission to truth. You can't believe what they said about you.
Like ancient Kemet, a good bit of the Dogon star and calendar system centers around Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the heavens. This is a great time at this time of year to see it, because it's really most brilliant in the winter sky. All you do is you look at the southern heavens right about now, look for Orion, and look for the three belts of Orion and follow it right down, and there Sirius is. Outside the solar system, the brightest of the heavenly bodies. And the source of the calendar, ancient calendar of Kemet and the Dogon. The Dogon have 4 calendars also. One of them is based on Sirius. But what is more interesting from the point of view of Dogon is that they have a system around this body right there. These are artifacts. These are not, but this is actually a star. That star is called, by modern scientists, Sirius B. The Dogon call it P.T.A.H, the seed star or the star of deep beginnings. Well, what about P.T.A.H called Sirius B? The Dogon have apparently known about it for 700 years. It was not discovered in the West until 1862. The reason why it was so difficult to see is because it is a white dwarf star. The Dogon call it a white. What is a white dwarf? A star, when our sun, or a star the size of the sun, comes to the end of its life and exhausts its fuel, it will first expand into a red giant, and the sun will gobble up the entire solar system as far as Mars, but then it will become so big that it will have to collapse down, and it will collapse down in a mighty explosion to a white dwarf. So the sun will become the size of maybe the moon, so all that mass is concentrated in a small body. The weight of a single teaspoon of a white dwarf like Sirius B is about 100 tons, because it is so small, dense, and heavy. The Dogon describe all of this. They describe Sirius B as being a white seed, is what they call it. It's very small, very dense, and very heavy. The Dogon say that it is composed of a metal not found on Earth they call Sagala, and it has been determined through spectrographic analysis that is exactly what it is composed of, a degenerate metal. They even describe, you see, when a red giant explodes to contract down a white dwarf, that is a nova explosion. It lights up the sky. The Dogon described that. The connections between white dwarfs and supernovas weren't even known until 1914. The Dogon even describe matter being made up of incredibly small spinning particles, i.e. atoms. They describe all of the constellations of being composed of countless of stars spinning in space as galaxies. They describe the 4 moons of Jupiter, and these people, to all intents and purposes, don't have even a system of writing that we know about. At least not one that anyone has ever discovered. They have, therefore, a knowledge of the cosmos and of the heavens and astronomy that rivals modern knowledge. This was found in Saqqara, dated to 300 BC, and at first was said to be a bird, until a NASA engineer said, next slide please, Birds do not have reverse dihedral wings and vertical tails. So this is a glider and an aerodynamically sound glider. Not an airplane, but it just shows you that in African science they had already started experimenting with aerodynamics 300 years before Jesus was born. So again, why are we afraid to be engineers?
Back in the day when I was schooling, blind and unwise to the lies my professor was spewing forth like it was written in stone, I didn't know that under him, yo, the truth was unknown.
Research and other research. And that is why Egypt had to be claimed by the Europeans. That's why the Europeans had to make Egypt a European country, a white country, in spite of the fact. In spite of the fact. But you, in trying to become and make yourself equal, everything got to be equal. I'm not equal to nobody. I am it. You cannot come to me to learn mathematics, and I gave the world 1 to 9. When the world didn't have anything, I was counting. I had a written language I call Meduneta, the writing of the gods. There was no Greece and no Etrusca and no Pyrrhus yet. That later became Rome and Greece. When I was going into chemistry, I left my writings in 100 of them that now they even call the Rockefeller papyrus, the Edwin C. Smith medical papyrus. This Edwin C. Smith is a surgical papyrus dealing with operation in the human spine. 1700 BC, 700 years before Rome or Greece. And he claimed the creation of Rome and Greece. I can do more in proving to you that Rome and Greece was not Europe than anybody else can prove that Egypt was not Africa. Rome and Greece was not Europe. Two Mediterranean-inspired nations, because when they rose, there was no Europe. That's hard on your imagination. What created Europe? The challenge of Rome and Greece. Fighting Rome and Greece, they got themselves together to fight it or try to destroy it. Getting themselves together to fight this challenge made them a nation. They began to have facsimile nations, and they weren't even clear on the nation concept in Europe until near the end of the 18th and the 19th century. And you actually go, here's the people who came in the world civilized, and Europe was born when the ancient world was ending at the beginning of the modern world. There was no Europe in ancient times.
Documents we can read very easily, and there may well be independent confirmation of the historicity of some form of a Trojan War in those documents. And so what I'm really asking is, why is it that we're just really looking in one direction when we're talking about the origins of Greek civilization?
When Alexander entered Egypt, he wrote home to his mother and said that he at last reached the land where the Greek gods began, Apollo and Zeus. And he wanted to consult one of the great African teachers of oracles. And the oracle asked, "How old is this man?" He said, 32. They said, "In 20 years, maybe he'll be wise enough to ask me a question that I care to answer."
In studying, I started to go back to God rock. And then I came back and forth and find out, why are you such hypocrites? Tomorrow you're going into Sunday you're going into your church, and you're going to call on the God, your ancient God, and don't know it. Next time I'll tell you, you're going to say the only one to free you is Jesus, but you call him Ammon. You don't know that you're still calling an Ammon-Ra, because somebody likes you and said it means so be it. It doesn't mean so be it. Ammon was the god of the north of Egypt, or the lower Egypt. Ra was the god of southern Egypt. When the hero of the south, Nama, otherwise called Mana, defeated the hero of the north to unify the land, Scorpion, and he won, he joined the two names, Ammon-Ra.
The power's in the knowledge. Join the glorious struggle to maintain and stand solid. One people on a mission of truth. You can't believe what they've been saying about you. Check out Kemet New. The power's in the knowledge. So join the glorious struggle to maintain, stand solid. One people on a mission of truth. You can't believe what they've been saying about you. You better check Kemet New. The power's in the knowledge. Join the glorious struggle to maintain and stand solid. One people on a mission of truth. Don't believe what they said about you. Check out Kemet New. Back in the day when I was schooling, blind and unwise to the lies my professor was spewing forth like it was written in stone. I didn't know that under him, yo, the truth was unknown. While we kept learning about the history, the questions arose. We thought about those that played down the misery and pain good for generations. That was never the subject of the class conversation. How can we be expected to not see the obvious hypocrisy in that new democracy? George Washington, father of the nation, had 300 slaves on his own plantation. Come on, since when does the good one does overshadow participating in the greatest Holocaust that ever was? No wonder Mama sent me to college. No wonder she said, son, remember, the power's in the knowledge.
The land masses of the world in favor of
Join
Europe.
the glorious struggle to maintain
The
and stand
P.T.A.H map
silent.
shows the northern hemisphere, which is 18.9 million square miles, to be more than 2/3 of the land mass. It compresses the southern hemisphere, 38.6 million square miles, into the remaining 1/3.
With jet black faces once
The Peters
walked the earth
projection
all
map
alone, no
was
other
created
races,
in
until he traveled to the
1974,
other lands,
more
colder than the
accurately
motherland,
represents all
and then
land
the cross began.
according to their relative
That's when the
size.
frost began, the
While
pigment
it
loss
does
began. The further
take
north this
distortion
man
of land
traveled
areas,
as he
it
crossed
is
new
considered
land. The
small
man in the
trade-off
ice who once walked
because
in the
all land
sand.
masses are proportionally
Soon he
represented.
began to lose his tan. Get on the inside. He was still African. And I asked my teacher, he had nothing much to say to me. Kept seeking the truth, only more questions came to me. Kept seeking the truth about how all this came to be. Kept seeking the truth about how they was blaming me. Kept seeking the truth, and now it's plain to see. Kemet New made it all clear to me. The man in the ice, guess what? The man who was blaming me, yo, he came from me. The power's in the knowledge. Join the glorious struggle to maintain and stand solid. One people on a mission of truth. Don't believe what they said about you. Check Kemet New. Kemet New Productions, Master Teachers Mary Rod and Ashra Kwesi on a mission of truth. Want to see the proof? Want to get that power? The power's in the knowledge, but it only comes to you when you know what your ancestors did, because only then do you know what you can do. Check out Kemet New.